I'm Justin from Consumer Reports. I'm going to be talking about the importance of public interest testing, specifically what public interest testers can learn from the history of security researchers. There's been a long history of security researchers encountering policy and practical difficulties in their work. And as we think about testing AI and other complicated systems, how can we incorporate some of the learnings from that into how we proceed on that? So first, why does Consumer Reports care about testing? Testing is obviously who we are as an organization. We've been around for 85 some years, have a history of testing cars and dishwashers and refrigerators and applications and all sorts of things to try to provide information to the marketplace about what works, what is the most effective and fast and energy efficient and dangerous product in order to kind of help consumers to make informed choices. For the last several years, we've been testing products more and more for attributes like privacy and security. Smart TVs now, other connected devices have, they're connected to the internet. They're run by software. They do have the potential to present privacy and security concerns to folks. We started back in 2015. We were reviewing fertility apps. We found an app that was exposing sensitive fertility data with a number of vulnerabilities, tried to work with the company to address them, and since then have been trying to formalize our research into ratings. And so now when you look to buy a smart TV, which has like the brightest screen, which has the best sound, and here's how to set up the settings. But we increasingly now we have a score for privacy, which ones are good on privacy, which ones are good on security. And then we're trying to expand that into looking into other things, looking into auditing AI systems to see what works, where there may be potential bias. And so we've done a number of investigative journalism stories, looking in things like pulse oximeters and insurance pricing that shows there are times when systems lead to unfair results for people. But as I think most of the folks in this room know, testing external systems or adversarial testing is really hard. You often have a very limited visibility into what you're looking into. You can see this is what we see in the labs. Is this what the rest of the world is seeing? Plus, obviously, everything's run by software now, so with a software update, it can change radically. And so traditionally, Consumer Reports would put our ratings in a magazine, but then if the next day, the system got an update. Think of Teslas. Teslas are constantly pushing updates to the system. May radically change how the system works. It may now have self-driving. It may have dangerous self-driving. It may have a governor to say it only goes 55 miles per hour. And so how do we design our systems to account for changes in software? This talk is derived largely from a paper called Opening Black Boxes, which is helpfully hyperlinked there for everybody. Maybe someone can put in the chat the paper. This is the paper my colleague Nandita Sampath wrote for us last year after spending several months kind of looking at some the legal impediments to AI testing. She was supposed to deliver this talk. Unfortunately, she took a different job a couple weeks ago doing full-time AI testing, so good for her and it's good for the people she's testing. But now I'm backing up for her. One caveat is I'm not a technologist. I have a legal and policy background. I've done a lot of work on privacy testing specifically, but I know that I'm talking to a room full of people who've done more rigorous testing than I have. But that's one of the cool things about Enigma conference that is multidisciplinary. So I've spent a lot of time with the policy issues and the policymakers who are starting to think about this from a less sophisticated perspective. So if I say something that seems wrong or stupid or underinformed, please let me know and tell you no, that's not what we're worried about. This is what we're actually worried about. And so why is public interest AI testing important? Obviously, AI affects more and more of our day-to-day lives. Things like credit scoring were traditionally very stupid algorithms. Now we're seeing startups who are doing more and more sophisticated, looking at more attributes and maybe looking into systems in less explainable ways. There are tenant screening algorithms, there are hiring algorithms, all of which have an effect on our day-to-day lives. The things that we're probably most interested in testing, though, there may be more things I'm not thinking about, is one, bias. Are there bias in systems that are leading to biased results? Amazon famously had a hiring algorithm that evaluated resumes, and it turns out that guys named Chad who played lacrosse were ranked highest, potentially reflecting historical biases. But then also effectiveness. Do these things work? There's a ton of AI snake oil out there. Companies like promising this will do everything. If you're making a promise about self-driving, does that really work? How do we test for that and tell people, no, maybe it works in this track, but does not work in these other environments? Obviously, in a perfect world, self-regulation would do it, but I think obviously that people do not have sufficient motivations. Even if they were, maybe they're hard to see. Or again, these are complicated systems where it's hard to tell what's going on all the time. And then finally, when I say auditing, I don't mean like KPMG. I mean like all of us, like anyone else outside the company. We need people who are able to kick the tires, regulators, journalists, testers like us, researchers, academics, to kind of hold people to account for what they do. So quickly, just a couple kind of famous examples of AI auditing systems. NYU had a system called Ad Observatory. It was something that you could install into your browser. It would whenever you went to Facebook and I think YouTube, it would collect political content that you were collecting there, as well as information about why it may have been targeted to you, to try to get a sense of what's going on, why are you getting this certain content. Eventually, Facebook actually deprecated access to Ad Observatory. They were under a consent decree with the Federal Trade Commission for letting companies like Cambridge Analytica, third-party software access systems. They said, if we can't let Cambridge Analytica do it, can we let NYU do it? But I think people recognize the value to knowing why we're getting targeted with certain political content. And then another example, and there are dozens of examples, ProPublica a few years ago did a story on sentencing algorithms. These are real algorithms that judges were using to decide whether to send someone back to jail or to let them out early. They looked at the scores that people were given and then looked at later recidivism rates, and saw that it was leading to biased results. Black defendants were incorrectly identified as more likely to commit crimes going forward. White defendants were getting unfairly high scores or low scores, depending on how you look at it, saying they were less likely than they actually were to commit crimes. So just a couple of examples of important ways that AI systems are intermediating our lives. I want to say a couple of ways about different ways to test AI systems. This comes from this formulation comes from a paper that Christian Sandvig put out a couple of years ago about different ways to test systems. So code, you can get access to the code and be able to look at everything there. One example from recent years is Twitter. Their face cropping algorithm was alleged to have biased results. If you posted a picture of two different people, the cropping algorithm would tend to gravitate toward the lighter face, leading to the white people were more likely to be shown in feed than darker skinned people. And Twitter, to their credit, made the algorithm available and said, okay, find out what went wrong here. Can be helpful. In some cases, it may not be. It may be too overwhelming. If Consumer Reports had access to all of Google's search algorithms, I'm not sure we can make sense of it. And also, even if you have the code, without the training data, it may not be worthwhile, right? The code, if the code is learning from training data that does reflect historical biases, you may not be able to see that unless you have access to that data as well. Crowdsourcing, again, you can recruit people to kind of show this is my experience with this algorithm and kind of bring that all together to see, to maybe try to find some truth. Consumer Reports has done a ton of this. Like I mentioned, we've done studies on insurance pricing that showed that in traditionally redlined areas, people were getting artificially higher prices, even when accounting for other criteria. But this can be hard to do at scale. It's hard to collect and normalize the data. If you're collecting data from 15 different companies, their bills all look differently. It's challenging to do it in practice. It may also, if your people who volunteer all look a certain way, it may not be representative of the general population. Scraping, again, there's a ton of publicly available data out there. NYU Ad Observatory is an example of a kind of combo. Crowdsourced, you would install the software, but then it would automatically scrape for you. Again, but are you allowed to scrape? Then you start to run into potential legal issues I'm going to talk about in a second. And then sock puppet accounts. You can create a bunch of fake accounts, and then you can make them look however you want. They can reflect whatever demographics you're trying to test. This may be tough to do at scale. Can you create 100, 1,000, 10,000 in order to get scientifically legitimate results? And then will a company let you create 10,000 fake accounts from one IP address, right? They have legitimate reasons to stop inauthentic activity, and so you may not be able to generate the data you need or the inputs you need to test the system. And so what does this all have to do with security testing? And so I think some of the laws that have made us nervous as we're doing testing on security, have also hindered us as we're thinking about how to test AI systems. And so the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act famously limits computer hacking. If I'm accessing a system in ways that are slightly different from the way that the system is presented to the world, is that hacking? Does that invite criminal liability? There's been some helpful cases on this in recent years I'm going to talk about in a second, but there's also state laws that are often vaguer and more confusing, and there's not a lot of law interpreting what they do. Contract law, okay, even if violating a contract is not hacking, is there legal recourse? If the contract says, if you violate this, you owe me $100,000 in liquidated damages, is that going to scare me off as a researcher? If they prohibit fake accounts, am I liable now or potential can be sued for that? Is there a prohibition on publishing testing results? There's been a long history of software companies say, no, you may not publish results about us in their legal agreements. They've traditionally been called Oracle clauses. Oracle is one of the first companies to innovate in this area. Or you can test, but you have to come to us for permission, let us complain and whine to you first about your results. We've also seen companies say, you assign us a copyright in any test results you put out about us, and therefore if we don't like it, we can take it down. So a lot of different ways to kind of get to that. And then there's an open legal question about robots.txt. This is the signal a website can kind of publish to the world saying, don't scrape me. If I violate that, is that illegal? I think it's an open question. The DMCA had the provision about circumventing anti-copying measures. If again, may be useful for testing, again, intended for limiting copyright abuse, but does on its face apply to a lot of basic security testing systems. And then obviously there are practical challenges like access. How do I get enough data to have informed results about how the system works for a representative population? And then this is one I'm really interested in, actions to evade testing. If a system thinks it's being tested and behaves differently, is that legal? Famously, Volkswagen, when Volkswagen thought they were in the EPA testing lab, they shuttered down their emissions and put out lower NO2 and SO2. And then they got in trouble for that, but that's mostly because they promised there were low emissions, and that was not true. There's also been a long history of people thinking that cell phones, when they are undergoing common benchmarking tests, might run a little bit hotter or do a little bit differently in order to make it look like they're more effective than they actually are in a production environment. And then there's a story from a few years ago. Uber, they allegedly configured their software that when they were being tested by San Francisco or California regulators, I'm not sure, they would behave differently. They would give them better rates or do something differently. But again, the company's software is smarter. Software, again, can adapt. If it can adapt to testing environments, it makes it harder for us to provide detailed information to the public. That said, we have this history of security researching, and things have gotten, the policy environment has adapted in a number of ways to make things better. Again, I think maybe 20 years ago, the anti-hacking statutes, they're a little bit more scary. Now policymakers are adapting to try to allow for people to hold these companies to account. So there have been some really strong cases interpreting the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Sandwich v. Barr was a case where academics were creating stock puppet accounts in violation of terms of service. The court said, no, that's not hacking. That's just a violation of the contract. May violate other things, but it isn't criminal. Van Buren versus the United States was a Supreme Court case from just last term. In that case, I think Van Buren was a police officer in Georgia, and he had access to a police database, but he was accessing it for super sketchy reasons to access friends, girlfriends. In that case, the court said, again, it's not hacking. He had access to the system, it just exceeded it. That's not criminal hacking. So again, makes security researchers who may have access to a system but are doing slightly different things to it less likely to be charged with criminal hacking. And then last year, the Department of Justice put out a policy statement, said they're not going to prosecute people for doing good faith security hacking under the Consumer Fraud and Abuse Act. Again, helpful, could be rescinded, doesn't apply to state laws, but again, I think progress only applies to security hacking. Hopefully, they would also interpret it as applying to AI and other sorts of public interest good faith testing as well. The DMCA, like I said, if you circumvent anti-copying technologies, you can get in trouble, but they do provide for exceptions. The Library of Congress, I don't know why it's the Library of Congress, but every 3 years they put out exceptions that it's okay to circumvent for these purposes. And for the last several rounds, they have identified good faith security testing as an exception that doesn't violate the DMCA. There's also been some good developments in consumer protection law in the last few years. So I mentioned oracle clauses that are limiting people's ability to test. State attorneys general have gone after companies for putting those clauses in their contracts. And so McAfee and Blue Coat are two examples where a state attorney general said, no, that's not enforceable. And not only is it not enforceable, putting it in the contract is deceptive. You're fooling people into think they're not allowed to test you. But there's a public interest value to doing it. Rocket Lab was a similar case from the Federal Trade Commission that gets to that kind of copyright trick I talked about, where you assign a copyright in any review or content about people. A few years ago, Congress actually passed a law, the Consumer Review Fairness Act, which says consumers have a right to publish good faith reviews of companies. It doesn't go so far as say a right to test, a right to necessarily kick the tires, but if you have an opinion, you're allowed to say it, and contractual clauses can't stop you from doing that. I mentioned this question of is fooling a tester deceptive or unfair? If someone in Consumer Reports Labs operates in a different way to try to trick us into giving it a better, an unfair review. This is an open question that I think is really important. The law says you can't deceive a consumer. It doesn't necessarily say you can't deceive a tester. I think the current law is definitely unclear on that. Alternatively, you can argue it's an unfair business practice. That's a practice that causes harm. It is not offset by benefits, but this is an area there's not a lot of guidance out there for testers. A couple other areas where I think we're seeing regulators start to get, this is not necessarily victory yet, but I think we're starting to see regulators and policymakers think about it, is that maybe auditing mandates in certain cases, maybe not requiring people to publish code, but maybe for certain algorithms and AI systems that have important legal results, you have an obligation to have a third party look at it. That's something we're seeing in legislation of the federal government, in DC state government, California, and Washington. Again, more nascent, but I think it's the things that people are starting to think about. And then whistleblower protections. I know the next panel is talking about whistleblowers, but again, testing's got limitations. You can't find everything, and so having protections for insiders who see wrongdoing. Again, a lot of the new laws that are thinking about AI, thinking about transparency, do have explicit protections for whistleblowers. Again, not in effect yet, but there is a long history of regulation, especially around False Claims Act, government contracting, to protect and even reward and encourage whistleblowers in some cases. Sorry, just a couple more slides. I know I started late. Apologies. So what can companies do in the meantime? In some cases, open sourcing, again, may be helpful. I've certainly heard regulators talk about that if you do open source your coding, it seems like a show of good faith, that you're trying to avoid bias or you're trying to generate fair results. Again, we've learned a lot from security bug bounty programs over the last 10 more years. I mentioned the example of Twitter and the cropping algorithm as an algorithmic bug bounty program. Could be useful to see more of that in the wild. And then finally, what can people who want to see a better policy environment for testers can do? Like I said, policymakers are a lot more open to this. I think 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, a hacker was still a loaded term, and people were worried about bad faith breaking of systems. And I think prosecutors often brought unhelpful and in some cases disastrous prosecutions. Policymakers, I think, are different these days. Not all of them, but I think there is progress and there is more of a recognition that things need to be done to allow for third-party testing, to allow for accountability. And so there are some policy vehicles that may be moving on this. Most explicitly, short-term, I mentioned the DMCA every 3 years puts out exceptions for the DMCA, where it's okay to circumvent anti-copying technology. And it's up for review this summer. So again, it could be expanded to be from just security testing to testing for other sorts of testing, other sorts of research, other sorts of things that can be done, again, to hold some of these inscrutable and difficult to parse black boxes accountable for what they do. With that, thank you for your patience in technical delays, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this. Thanks.